Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're not just exploring the vast history of ancient South Asia. We are performing kind of a deep excavation, looking into the intellectual architecture that lets us understand that history.
Yeah, exactly.
Think of it like getting the master keys to the library.
It's absolutely a dive into methodology.
Mhm.
Our mission really is to give you the foundational framework that scholars actually use. The physical canvas of the subcontinent, the way they divide time, the clock, so to speak,
Right.
and the evolving, often really complex lens of interpretation, what we call historiography.
And this material, it comes from an academic introduction to the field, so it's focusing squarely on those critical concepts, the tools of the trade. But before we get too bogged down in theory, let's start with a fact, something that really anchors this entire region we're talking about.
Okay.
The names India, Hindu, and Hindustan. Three massive terms defining modern and ancient identity. They all came from just one geographical feature.
That's right, the mighty river Sindhu.
Yeah.
What we know today as the Indus.
It's incredible.
It really is. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is that this single etymological root, a river, it highlights a fundamental tension in studying ancient South Asia.
Which is,
Are we as the region defined more by how outsiders saw it or by its own internal narratives?
yeah.
That push and pull is constant.
And that leads us straight into the central methodological problem for this deep dive, something you, the listener, need to keep in mind throughout.
Yes.
Historians of ancient India often have to work with two kinds of evidence, both deeply flawed, often contradictory.
Okay, like what?
You've got these myth-laden texts, usually written by elites, Brahmins often,
Yeah.
and then you have silent archaeological sites, just stuff, no words.
Right. Artifacts, ruins.
Exactly. And the huge challenge for the field is fusing those two broken toolkits somehow into a coherent, complex story.
Precisely. It's like trying to build with mismatching parts. Let's see how that tension plays out, starting with the ground itself, the geography.
Okay, let's unpack the geographical stage first. The subcontinent as a single canvas. Now, when you look at a map today, you see, 6, 7 modern nation-states? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh.
Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, yeah.
But the source material makes a really crucial point here. The idea of the Indian subcontinent as a single, distinct geographic and cultural unit. That's ancient. It goes way, way back, long before these modern borders.
That historical continuity is absolutely vital. You have to kind of step back from the modern political map
Right.
and see this whole area, defined by the Himalayas up north, the ocean on three sides, as one big interacting cultural zone throughout much of history.
And this unity, it isn't just a convenient idea for historians, is it? It's rooted in how people thought back then, in ancient imagination.
Exactly, which takes us straight into the Puranic texts and their cosmography.
Cosmography. Okay, so that's where geography kind of blends with myth and cosmology.
Precisely. It's their map of the universe, but it's also got geographical markers mixed in.
Yeah.
They had this really structured cosmos.
How did they picture the world?
They saw it in layers, basically.
Yeah.
Concentric circles of land masses called divipas and seas, alternating.
Oh.
You had the familiar saltwater sea, but then, get this, a sea of molasses, then one of wine, then butter, curd, milk, and finally fresh water.
Seas of butter and wine. That's something else.
It is. And right at the dead center of this whole cosmic structure was Jambudva.
Jambudvipa. And how does that mythological center relate to the subcontinent we actually recognize on a map?
Well, Fortavarsha, that's the ancient name we're looking for the subcontinent, it was placed in the southernmost part of this central landmass, Jambudvipa.
Okay, so geographically south within the central cosmic island.
Right. And the golden Mount Meru, sometimes identified with the North Pole or the world axis, the axis mundi, was thought to rise right from its middle.
So putting themselves south of the mythical center.
Yeah.
But what's the significance of that? Why does that matter?
It gave the region a kind of inherent status, a defined place within the grand cosmic order, cultural, spiritual prestige. And the name itself, Bharatavarsha, it's linked to the legendary King Bharata.
The son of Dushyanta and Shakuntala from the epics.
That's the one. And here's the fascinating part. While the framework is clearly mythological, the Puranic texts that describe the 9 divisions, the khandas, of Bharatavarsha, they list specific mountains, rivers, cities, places we can totally recognize today.
Ah, so myth and real geography are woven together.
Exactly. That tension again. They have this idea of mythologized centrality, but also detailed empirical geographic knowledge. It shows the composers knew the diverse regions intimately, and crucially, they conceived of them as a single functional whole. Farasaka was the subcontinent.
So there's this internal conception, Fartafresha, but the name that's stuck globally, the one most people use, India, it comes from outside, right? Focus on that one massive landmark.
The Indus River.
Yeah.
Or Sindhu in Sanskrit. This starts way up in the Tibetan plateau, flows for, what, about 3,200 kilometers?
Huge river.
Before emptying into the Arabian Sea. A truly defining feature. And its name, like you said, became the basis for how outsiders saw the entire region.
It's quite an etymological journey, crossing continents. Can you walk us through how Sindhu morphed into India and Hindu?
Sure. So the first point of contact seems to be the Persians. The Achaemenid king Darius, in his inscriptions from around the 6th century BCE, he refers to the area as Hidu.
Hidu. Why the H?
Well, the Iranian sound system often changes an initial Sanskrit S sound into an H. So the river name, Sindhu, becomes Hindu.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then later, the Greeks learned about the region, probably through these Persian accounts. They tended to drop initial consonants sometimes, or maybe just adapt to the Persian form. Anyway, they ended up with India.
So Sindhu, Hindu, India.
Basically, yeah. And it wasn't just them.
Right. You mentioned the Chinese, too.
Yes, ancient Chinese sources call the area Shen-Tu, another variation. But here's the key thing. Initially, all these external names, Hidu, India, Shen-Tu, they were very localized.
Just referring to the immediate area around the river.
Exactly. Just the lower Indus Valley, more or less.
But that changed. The scope widened pretty dramatically. When did India start meaning the whole subcontinent?
We see that shift quite clearly by the 4th century BCE. Megasthenes.
The Greek ambassador.
Right, the ambassador of the court of Chandragupta Maurya. He was already using India to describe the whole vast geographical area, stretching way beyond the Indus Basin itself.
So quite early on, the term expanded.
It did, and much later, during the medieval period, Arabic and Persian texts solidified Hindustan for the landmass, and Hindu specifically for its inhabitants, often regardless of their specific religious sect initially. It's just a powerful example of how external perception, often based on the most accessible physical feature, can end up defining a huge, diverse region.
But the Indus region, as important as it is, it's just one piece of this massive, ecologically diverse puzzle. We really need to talk about the main physiographic zones and how they shaped history, how they interacted.
Absolutely. The landscape is just staggering in its variety. And it's defined by these massive barriers and climatic modifiers. Up top, you've got the Himalayas.
The giants.
Geologically young, remember. Still unstable, fold mountains. But beyond just being a physical barrier, their real historical importance is as a climate engine.
Yes, you mentioned their role with the monsoons earlier.
They are absolutely essential. In winter, they act like a giant wall, blocking those frigid winds blowing down from Siberia.
That keeps the Indo-Gangetic plains much warmer than they'd otherwise be. Habitable, really.
Okay.
Then in summer, they do the opposite. They trap the vital, rain-heavy southwest monsoon winds coming off the Indian Ocean.
Forcing them to drop their rain over the plains.
Exactly. That ensures the massive rainfall that basically created the Gangetic Plain as one of the world's great agricultural heartlands. Without the Himalayas, the whole system collapses.
And down south, the Western Ghats that range running along the west coast, they create similar effects, but more localized. They do. The Western Ghats run parallel to the coast. They force those same moisture-laden monsoon winds to rise really quickly.
Squeezing the rain out.
Right. Resulting in incredibly heavy rainfall along that narrow western coastal strip, places like Kerala and the Konkan coast, but immediately inland on the other side of the Ghats.
Rain shadow.
Big-time rain shadow. The Deccan Plateau behind them is much, much drier because the mountains have already taken most of the moisture out.
Okay, so let's break the subcontinent down into maybe its three main historical zones. What are they?
First, you've got the arid and semi-arid zones. Think the Thar Desert in Rajasthan and Gujarat, and the low-rainfall Sindh province in modern Pakistan.
Where the Indus is absolutely critical.
It's the lifeline, the sine qua non of life there. And this area also holds that historical mystery, the dried-up course of the Ghaggar-Hakra River.
Ah, yes, the Lost River.
It was once a massive river system, maybe parallel to the Indus, supporting Harappan settlements. But it dried up thousands of years ago. A huge environmental shift that undoubtedly impacted history profoundly.
Okay, Zone 1, arid west, then Zone 2.
Zone 2 is the powerhouse, the fertile northern alluvial plain, formed by the Ganga, the Ganges, and its many tributaries. This is the heartland.
And within that, you mentioned the Doab.
Yes, the Doab, literally two waters, the incredibly fertile land between the Ganga and its major tributary, the Yamuna.
Why was that specific strip so important historically?
Just phenomenal fertility. Plus, strategic location. Between two major rivers, it was defensible, easy to irrigate, massively productive. It generated the agricultural surplus needed to fund armies, build cities, support early states and empires.
So a center of power consolidation.
Absolutely. Control the Doab, control North India often. And this Great Plain stretches eastward through the Middle Plains, Bihar, eastern UP, and finally culminates in the huge eastern delta system. Bengal, Assam, Bangladesh, massive population center.
And then separating that whole northern plain from the south, you have that dividing line.
The Vindhya mountain range, running across central India. It's not as high as the Himalayas, but it marks a significant ecological and often cultural transition point.
Leading into Zone 3.
Zone 3, peninsular India, south of the Vindhyas. Geologically, it's totally different from the north. It's ancient, a very stable landmass dominated by the Deccan Plateau.
Formed by lava flows, you said.
Ancient lava flows, yeah. Creating that distinctive flat-topped landscape in many areas. This geological stability is a sharp contrast to the young, restless Himalayas.
And the Deccan is bordered by
The Western Ghats on the west, which we mentioned, and the lower, more broken Eastern Ghats on the east. The whole plateau generally slopes gently eastward.
which explains the river flow.
Exactly. That's why the major peninsular rivers, the Mahanadi, Godavari, Krishna, Kaveri, mostly flow eastwards into the Bay of Bengal. And you have distinct coastal plains, too. The Coromandel coast on the east, the Malabar and Konkan coasts on the west.
Okay, so we have these incredibly distinct zones. Mountains, deserts, fertile plains, ancient plateau. But the source material is really clear that despite these dramatic differences, these zones were not isolated. That idea of the single canvas holds because of interaction.
Interaction was absolutely constant. The subcontinent was never a sealed container. To the northwest, you had crucial mountain passes, the Khyber, the Bolan, the Gomal.
Gateways.
Essential arteries, really, connecting the subcontinent to Central Asia, West Asia, Iran, even Europe indirectly. This is how people, ideas, trade goods, armies flowed in and out for millennia.
And the sea routes were just as important as the land passes, maybe even more so at times.
Definitely. That enormous coastline, over 7,500 kilometers long, was a massive advantage. It linked South Asia into the entire Indian Ocean world. Trade and cultural exchange flourished with Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, even the Roman Empire.
So geography shaped settlement, farming, trade routes.
It influenced everything. But, and this is crucial, humans also shaped the geography. We can't just look at the modern environment.
Right, that point about ecology having a history.
Exactly. Humans have been transforming this landscape for thousands of years. Deforestation, building irrigation systems, diverting rivers, intensive agriculture. It all changes the environment.
So the ecology the Harappans lived in was different from the ecology of the Mauryan period, which was different again from today.
Precisely. That's where things like paleo-environmental studies come in, analyzing ancient pollen, soil layers, river courses to reconstruct past environments. Understanding the rise and fall of the Harappan civilization, for instance, is impossible without considering climate change, shifting monsoon patterns, and those drying rivers like the Gagar-Hakra. The canvas itself changed over time.
Okay, so we have the canvas, the geography, now we need the clock. How do we divide up this immense span of ancient time? Periodization. And historically, this has been, well, fraught, contentious.
Deeply contentious. We have to start by tackling that old, deeply embedded, but really quite flawed religious model.
You mean the division into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods?
That's the one. It was largely established by colonial-era Orientalist scholars in the 19th century, and it's proved incredibly stubborn in popular thinking, even though academic historians have largely abandoned it for decades.
Why is it so flawed? I mean, the problems seem pretty obvious when you state it like that.
They really are glaring. The biggest inconsistency is the classification itself. If the first two periods are named after the dominant religion of the ruling elite Hindu rulers, then Muslim rulers, why does the third period suddenly switch to the nationality of the ruler, British, instead of their religion, Christian?
Yeah, that makes no sense if religion is the criterion.
It's completely inconsistent, but the deeper failing is analytical. It reduces incredibly complex historical change down to just the religious label of the king or sultan on the throne.
Ignoring everything else.
Pretty much. It ignores vast swaths of social life, economic changes, cultural developments, the lives of ordinary people, things that often continued with a remarkable continuity despite changes in the ruling dynasty or their religion. A peasant's life in a village might not have changed much whether the ruler in far-off Delhi was called a Maharaja or a Sultan or represented the British crown.
So when historians started moving away from this model, what kind of resistance did they encounter? Because it seems like a model that could be politically useful for some.
Oh, absolutely. Resistance often came precisely from those who found political utility in it. Nationalist historians, for instance, sometimes wanted to glorify a Hindu golden age before the Muslim conquest, which they saw as a decline. Later, communal politics also latched onto this simplistic framing.
So what model replaced it? What do historians use now?
The standard model used by most historians today is based more on socioeconomic patterns, broad structural shifts, rather than just elite religion or origin.
Okay, let's define those boundaries.
Generally, it's ancient, running from the earliest times up to roughly the 6th century CE, then early medieval from the 6th to about the 13th century CE, then medieval proper, 13th to 18th centuries, and finally modern from the 18th century onwards.
Okay, ancient, early medieval, medieval, modern. Why is the cutoff for ancient placed specifically around the 6th century CE? That seems quite precise. Is it tied to the fall of the Gupta Empire?
It's related to the decline of the Guptas, yes, but the justification isn't just dynastic change. It reflects deeper, more widespread socio-economic transformations happening around that time across large parts of the subcontinent.
Like what?
We see a noticeable decline in large urban centers that had characterized the earlier Mauryan, Kushan, and Gupta periods. There are changes in land ownership patterns, the structure of agrarian production, maybe a decline in long-distance trade for a while. And politically, you see the clear emergence of powerful, regionally focused kingdoms. It marks a transition to what scholars call an early medieval social and political formation, more decentralized, more regionalized.
Got it. So it's about deeper structures, not just emperors changing. Now, within that vast ancient period itself, the most fundamental dividing line, the real game changer, is literacy, right? Prehistory versus history.
Writing, that's the watershed. Prehistory is that enormous, almost unimaginable stretch of human existence before writing was invented. History, technically, is the study of societies after they develop writing.
Why is writing such a crucial dividing line?
Because writing allows information, memory, knowledge to escape the bounds of individual human memory and the span of a single generation. It can be stored, accumulated, transmitted accurately across vast distances in time.
And as we noted earlier, South Asia seems to have been a bit late to the global writing party compared to, say, Mesopotamia or Egypt.
Relatively speaking, yes. Cuneiform script in Mesopotamia, those wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets, that goes back to maybe 300-400 BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphics, maybe 3100 BCE.
Whereas the earliest substantial evidence in South Asia is the Harappan script. What do we know about what they wrote on?
The Harappan script, which emerges around 2600 BCE or even a bit earlier based on recent finds, is found overwhelmingly on small, square steatite seals and the clay tags, or sealings, made from them.
Seals, suggesting maybe trade, administration, identity marking.
That's the general assumption, yes. Perhaps marking ownership of goods, authenticating transactions, maybe some ritual function too. It's very different from Mesopotamia, with its thousands of administrative and literary clay tablets, or Egypt using papyrus scrolls made from river reeds.
Does the lack of other materials mean the Harappans only wrote on seals?
Almost certainly not. We have to assume they also wrote on perishable materials, palm leaves, cloth, maybe wood things that just haven't survived thousands of years in the subcontinent's often harsh climate, especially the humidity. That lack of survival is probably a key reason why the Harappan script evidence is relatively sparse compared to the script itself, which seems quite developed.
Okay, so when writing does appear and becomes established, what fundamental changes does it bring to a society?
It generally coincides with and enables the rise of more complex societies, cities and states. Writing is an essential tool for bureaucracy, for administration.
How so?
Rulers use it to record laws, issue decrees, manage taxes, keep track of resources, project their power and ideology. Think of Ashoka's monumental rock edicts, broadcasting his message across the empire. Merchants use it for contracts, accounts, long-distance trade networks. Priests use it to codify rituals, preserve sacred texts accurately, maintain religious traditions over centuries. It allows for a level of social organization and continuity that's very hard to achieve purely through oral means.
But you mentioned a dark side to literacy earlier. It wasn't all progress and light.
Definitely not. Literacy invariably created new forms of power and privilege. For most of history, only a tiny fraction of the population could read and write, usually scribes, priests, administrators, maybe some merchants.
So knowledge becomes controlled.
Absolutely. Literacy conferred enormous power on this small elite. They controlled the flow of information, the interpretation of texts, access to administrative roles. It created deep social hierarchies within society between the literate and the non-literate.
Yet, even after writing became relatively common in South Asia, oral transmission didn't just disappear. You mentioned it retained a special significance. Why?
Several interconnected reasons. Firstly, simple reach. In a vast, diverse subcontinent with relatively low literacy rates for much of its history, oral performance storytelling, recitation, singing remained the primary way to transmit culture, news, and religious ideas to the masses. It just had greater outreach.
Okay, practicality. What else?
There was also a strong sense of the sacredness of the spoken word, particularly for certain texts like the Vedas. These were considered Shruti, that which is heard. They were divine revelations embodied in sound.
So writing them down might be seen as diminishing them.
Exactly. Perfect memorization and precise pronunciation were paramount. The act of recitation itself was a ritual. Writing was sometimes seen as potentially polluting or simply inadequate to capture the true essence and power of these sacred sounds. So, oral tradition maintained immense prestige and importance even alongside literacy.
This complex interplay brings us to a major chronological headache, the writing gap after the Harappans, and why we need this term proto-history. You flag this as confusing because the term seems to mean different things in different contexts, especially for India. Can we try to untangle that?
Yes, it is definitely confusing, and that confusion really highlights the unique challenges of the South Asian evidence. The term proto-history becomes necessary precisely because the history of writing here isn't a simple linear progression. There are gaps and ambiguities.
Okay, let's start with the standard European definition. What does proto-history mean there?
In the classic European context, it usually refers to a society or people who did not have their own writing system, but who are mentioned in the contemporary written records of a neighboring literate culture.
Give us an example.
Think of, say, certain Celtic or Germanic tribes on the fringes of the Roman Empire. They didn't write their own histories, but Roman authors like Tacitus wrote about them. So they enter the historical record via external literate sources. That's proto-history in that sense.
Okay, illiterate people described by literate neighbors. But that doesn't fit the Harappan civilization at all. How are they proto-historic?
Right. The Harappan case is definition number 2, specific to contexts like the Indus Valley. The Harappans were a literate culture. We know they had a script. We have hundreds of examples of it.
We can't read it.
Exactly. The script remains undeciphered. So they are proto-historic because we have their documents, their writing, but those documents are silent to us. We know they could write, but we don't know what they wrote.
Okay, so that's meaning number 2, literate but undeciphered script. Then there's that huge gap after the Harappan cities declined around 1900 BCE. What about that period?
Ah, yes. That long stretch, roughly from maybe 1500 BCE down to about 500 BCE. This period is also often called proto-historic in the Indian context, but for a third reason.
Why this time?
Because this is the era associated with the composition and transmission of the entire Vedic literary corpus, the Rig Veda, the later Vedas, Brahmanas, Upanishads. We have this vast body of literature from this period.
No writing.
There is virtually no surviving archaeological evidence of writing from this entire millennium. The strong consensus is that this entire complex literature was composed, memorized, and transmitted purely orally for centuries before eventually being written down much, much later. So it's proto-historic because we have the orally transmitted literature, but no contemporary evidence of writing itself.
Wow. Okay, so that's meaning 3. Oral literature, no contemporary writing evidence. And then the archaeologists throw in a 4th meaning.
Sort of, yes. Archaeologists sometimes use proto-history in a broader sense to cover the long period between the beginnings of food production, Neolithic, and the widespread adoption of iron technology, Iron Age. This encompasses the Neolithic and Chalcolithic, Copper Stone Age cultures.
Why that grouping?
Because these cultures are defined primarily by their material remains, pottery types, tools, settlement patterns, early farming, and they generally predate historically documented periods or widespread literacy. So it's an archaeological classification based on technology and subsistence, existing alongside the other text-based definitions.
Okay, so with all this ambiguity, undeciphered scripts, oral traditions, writing gaps dating the actual start of history with a capital H, meaning literate, documented history, must be tricky. When do historians generally agree the historical period properly begins in South Asia?
It is tricky, and the answer differs slightly for North and South India. For North India, the oldest deciphered script we have is Brahmi. The earliest substantial examples are the famous Ashokan inscriptions from the 3rd century BCE.
So 3rd century BCE.
That's the earliest deciphered writing. However, most historians actually place the beginning of the historical period in North India a bit earlier, around the 6th century BCE.
Why earlier if the writing evidence is later?
Based on other evidence. By the 6th century BCE, we have clear textual references, in later texts admittedly, but referring to this period, to the emergence of early kingdoms and cities, the Mahajanapadas, named kings, the consolidation of states, and crucially, the lives and teachings of historical figures like the Buddha and Mahavira, founders of Buddhism and Jainism. The assumption is that writing on perishable materials likely existed by then to support this level of complexity, even if it hasn't survived.
Okay, so 6th century BCE for the North, based on a convergence of evidence suggesting complex, literate society, even if the surviving script is a bit later. What about the South, peninsular India?
The transition appears to happen somewhat later in the south. While we do find very early Brahmi inscriptions in Sri Lanka, potentially 4th century BCE.
At Anuradhapura, right.
Yes. But within the Indian peninsula itself, widespread evidence for literacy emerges a bit later. We start seeing Tamil Brahmi inscriptions, short labels usually on pottery or cave entrances, around the 2nd century BCE. And the rich body of classical Tamil literature, the Sangam poems, which describe early kingdoms like the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas, seem to reflect a society transitioning into history somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE.
So a slightly later start for documented history in the South compared to the North.
Generally, yes, based on current evidence, but there's that huge caveat.
If the Harappan script gets deciphered.
If that ever happens, the historical period for northern India, or at least the Indus region, would be instantly pushed back by over 1,500 years, back to the 3rd millennium BCE, or even earlier.
That would completely rewrite the textbooks.
It would be arguably the single most revolutionary discovery possible for understanding ancient South Asia. It would change everything about how we structure that early past. The 6th century BCE would suddenly become not a beginning, but a midpoint after a long literate history we currently can't access.
Okay, we've wrestled with geography and time. Now we need to look at the interpreters themselves, the history of how history has been written, historiography. Because how we read ancient sources is deeply shaped by the scholars who first dug them up, translated them, categorized them.
Absolutely. The lens matters as much as the object.
And the first major school, the dominant one for a long time, was the Orientalist or Indologist school, mainly European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yes, these figures, people like William Jones, James Prinsep, Alexander Cunningham, were absolutely foundational. We can't overstate their initial contribution. They undertook the immense task of systematically collecting ancient manuscripts, editing them, translating Sanskrit and other ancient languages.
Building the basic toolkit.
Exactly. But it's also crucial to remember they didn't do this in a vacuum. They relied heavily on the knowledge of traditional Indian scholars, particularly Brahmin Pandits, whose expertise was essential for understanding the texts and contexts.
But whose contribution wasn't always fully acknowledged.
Often not, and whose own perspectives and biases were often absorbed uncritically into the European scholarship. Anyway, these Orientalists pioneered entire fields.
Like epigraphy.
Yes, the study of inscriptions. James Prinsep's decipherment of the Ashokan Brahmi script in the 1830s was a monumental breakthrough, unlocking centuries of history. They also established numismatics, the study of coins, as a vital source for political history, reconstructing dynasties and timelines.
And they founded the ASI?
The Archaeological Survey of India, established in 1871 under Cunningham. This began the systematic, large-scale excavation and preservation of archaeological sites across the subcontinent. Their groundwork was immense.
And it's a big but. This work was happening firmly within a colonial power structure, which meant certain biases were almost inevitably baked in from the start. What were the main critiques leveled against this Orientalist school?
Several deep-seated biases profoundly shaped the field for generations. Firstly, there was a strong tendency towards an uncritical acceptance of the perspective presented in elite Brahmanical Sanskrit texts. They often took these texts as straightforward representations of reality, effectively prioritizing the history and worldview of the highest caste.
So a skewed perspective from the top down.
Yes. Secondly, their interpretations were often colored by an explicitly Western viewpoint. They judged Indian society and history against the standards of 19th century Europe industrialization, specific models of political progress, Christian morality, and frequently found India lacking or deficient by those measures.
And I remember reading the critique that they portrayed Indian society as fundamentally unchanging, static, and its politics as inherently despotic.
That was a really pervasive and damaging idea. They often argued that Indian society hadn't fundamentally changed for millennia, stuck in ancient patterns. And politically, they asserted that India had only ever known despotic rule, lacking any indigenous traditions of democracy, republicanism, or even limited monarchy.
Which conveniently justified colonial rule.
Precisely. If India was historically incapable of self-government or progress, and prone to despotism, then British rule could be presented as a benevolent, modernizing, and necessary intervention. It provided an ideological rationale for empire. They also tended to exaggerate foreign influence on Indian culture, and, as we discussed, they established that highly problematic Hindu-Muslim British periodization.
Okay, so this colonial narrative, unsurprisingly, provoked a powerful counter-reaction, especially as the Indian independence movement gained strength. This leads to the nationalist school of historians.
Exactly. Starting in the late 19th century and really flourishing in the first half of the 20th, you see Indian scholars consciously writing back against the colonial interpretations. Figures like R.C. Majumdar, R.K. Mukherjee, K.P. Jaiswal, they saw writing history as part of the anti-colonial struggle, a way to reclaim national pride and assert India's historical agency.
History as a tool for nation building. What were their main arguments, their key historical claims?
Their core tenets were often direct refutations of Orientalist claims. They insisted strongly on the indigenous roots of major Indian cultural, scientific, and philosophical developments, deliberately minimizing or downplaying foreign influences.
Okay.
Critically, they actively searched for historical golden ages periods they could portray as times of indigenous political unity, cultural flourishing, and national greatness, untouched by foreign domination.
Like the Vedic Age or the Gupta Empire.
Those were the favorites, yes.
All right.
They were presented as peaks of Hindu civilization. And importantly, to counter the colonial stereotype of universal despotism, they highlighted evidence for non-monarchical states in ancient India, like the Gathas and Sainas, early republics or oligarchies. They wanted to show India did have traditions of self-governance.
So correcting some colonial distortions, but potentially introducing new ones. It sounds like this could easily slide into glorification or romanticization.
It often did. And here's where the real problem lay. In their reaction against colonial historiography, they largely retained that same flawed Hindu-Muslim British periodization.
Why was keeping that framework so damaging?
Because they tended to intensely valorize the ancient Hindu period as the era of true national glory. Then, consciously or unconsciously, they often portrayed the subsequent arrival of Turkic rulers and the spread of Islam, the Muslim period, as a catastrophic break, a period of decline and foreign oppression.
Which fed into communal politics.
Tragically, yes. This historical narrative, emphasizing a glorious Hindu past disrupted by Muslim invaders, dovetailed neatly with and provided historical justification for the growing communal tensions and the Hindu nationalist politics emerging at the time. History became entangled with identity politics in a very divisive way.
Right. Okay, so after independence, particularly from the 1950s onwards, another major intellectual shift occurs. This time, it's Marxist historiography making waves. How did that change the game?
It was a radical departure in focus. Led by towering figures like Didi Kosambi and later R.S. Sharma, Irfan Habib, and others, this school shifted the entire lens of historical inquiry away from kings, dynasties, battles, and elite religion.
Towards what?
Towards socioeconomic structures and processes. The fundamental questions became, what were the modes of production? Who owned the land? What were the relations between classes? How was agricultural surplus extracted and distributed? How did social stratification work? It was about the material base of society.
So a shift from great men history to the history of systems and the masses.
Exactly. And a major contribution of this approach was that by focusing on class, exploitation, and agrarian relations, it inevitably brought the history of non-elite groups to the forefront.
The people left out of the earlier narratives.
Precisely. The peasants, the artisans, the laborers, the tribal groups, those who suffered subordination and marginalization. Marxist history aimed to uncover their experiences, their resistance, their role in shaping history from the bottom up. It was a crucial move towards writing a more inclusive, more democratic history.
But like the previous schools, early Marxist historiography wasn't without its own limitations or blind spots, was it?
No, it had its critiques too, especially in its initial phases. One common criticism was a tendency sometimes to apply historical models derived from European history, rigid stages like slavery or feudalism, somewhat mechanically onto the very different Indian context, without enough nuance.
Forcing the evidence into preset boxes.
Sometimes, perhaps. Also, while they certainly used archaeological evidence, their primary analytical framework often remained quite text-centric, interpreting material finds through the lens of theories derived from textual analysis. And arguably, the intense focus on class as the primary engine of history sometimes led to less attention being paid, initially, to other crucial axes of social stratification and identity, particularly caste and gender.
Okay, so that sets the stage for more recent developments. Over the last, say, 50 years, how has the field continued to evolve? What are the big trends correcting those earlier limitations?
So the field has become much more diverse, specialized, and self-critical. It's harder to talk about single-dominant schools now, but several key advances stand out. One is undoubtedly the gender revolution in history writing.
What did that involve?
Largely pioneered by women historians, this work moved decisively beyond just asking about the position of women in different periods, which often treated women as a monolithic, static category. Instead, it started analyzing gender itself as a fundamental principle of social organization, deeply intertwined with hierarchies of class, caste, ritual status, and political power.
So not just adding women, but rethinking the whole structure.
Exactly. It showed how notions of masculinity and femininity were constructed, contested, and used to legitimize power structures. It broke down that artificial divide between the private sphere of family and the public sphere of politics, showing how deeply interconnected they always were.
That sounds like a major conceptual shift. What else?
The impact of archaeology and scientific data is becoming much more profound. New theoretical approaches in archaeology, combined with scientific techniques, sophisticated dating methods, DNA analysis, paleoenvironmental studies, residue analysis on pottery, are transforming our understanding of basic things like subsistence patterns, ancient technologies, human-environment interactions, and migration. Historians are being forced to engage much more seriously with this non-textual data.
Moving beyond just using archaeology to illustrate texts.
Hopefully, yes. And related to that is the rise of detailed regional studies. Instead of trying to write grand pan-Indian narratives, much research now focuses on the specific historical trajectories of different regions and subregions, especially during the early medieval and medieval periods.
Looking at local sources.
Yes, intensive analysis of regional inscriptions, land grant charters, local chronicles, and vernacular literature. This highlights the immense diversity of political formations, agrarian systems, and cultural developments across the subcontinent. It challenges older, overly generalized models. Focus often falls on how political power was actually built and legitimized locally.
It's fascinating how these different schools, Orientalist, nationalist, Marxist, and these newer approaches clearly argued against each other. But looking back, did they share any common ground, perhaps common blind spots that persisted?
It's a good question. Despite their fierce ideological battles, you could argue that many of them, perhaps until very recently, shared a certain over-reliance on Brahmanical Sanskrit texts as the primary, most prestigious source for understanding ancient India. Even Marxists often built their models by analyzing Sanskrit legal and theoretical texts.
So the elite textual perspective remained quite central.
Often, yes. And related to that, there was frequently a tendency to marginalize archaeological evidence, or use it merely to confirm or illustrate points already derived from texts, rather than letting it generate its own independent narratives or challenge textual accounts.
And the legacy of those early Orientalist assumptions.
Some scholars argue that certain Eurocentric premises, ideas about linear progress, the definition of statehood, the separation of religion and politics, still subtly influence how the history of non-Western societies, including South Asia, is framed and interpreted, even today. Unpacking those inherited assumptions is an ongoing process.
Which brings us right back to that core methodological problem you raised at the start, the deep divide, the tension between archaeology and texts. This really seems like the biggest structural challenge facing the field right now.
It really is the crux of the matter, I think. We essentially operate with two parallel, often quite separate, streams of information about ancient South Asia. One comes from literary sources, epics, religious texts, legal codes, chronicles. The other comes from archaeological digs, pottery, tools, structures, bones.
And they tell different stories.
They often generate very different kinds of narratives at different chronologies, different rhythms of change. Literary sources tend to focus on elites, events, ideas, ideology. Archaeology gives us glimpses into daily life, technology, subsistence, settlement patterns, the world of ordinary people often absent from texts. The challenge is that these two streams run parallel but rarely seem to fully merge into a single, integrated historical understanding.
And our source material was quite critical of how historians often bridge this gap or fail to.
Yes, the critique, which I think has a lot of validity, is that historians often cherry-pick archaeological findings. They use an artifact or a site location simply as a convenient illustration or a bit of proof for an argument they've already constructed based purely on textual interpretation.
Using archaeology as a footnote.
It's essentially, yes. And conversely, archaeologists sometimes excavate and analyze material culture without fully engaging with the broader historical questions or the complex social and political context that texts might illuminate. The dialogue between the disciplines is often too shallow.
So what's the way forward? How do we create a more unified, nuanced narrative? What's the methodological solution proposed?
The fundamental shift needed is to move decisively away from text-centric history writing. That doesn't mean ignoring text. We need sophisticated literary analysis, understanding genre, bias, authorship, audience, all of that. But that textual study must be accompanied by a much deeper, more theoretically informed, and truly integral incorporation of archaeological evidence.
Letting archaeology shape the narrative, too.
Absolutely, letting it pose its own questions, challenge textual accounts, reveal aspects of life texts don't mention. The goal should be a more three-dimensional, complex picture of the past, one that can capture regional variations and, crucially, bring the history of ordinary and everyday life work, food, housing, local beliefs out of the shadows cast by elite-focused texts.
Speaking of shadows and things left out, there are huge gaps not just between disciplines, but also in geographical and demographic coverage. Which regions, which groups of people are still largely missing from the mainstream story of ancient India?
We definitely suffer from a heartland bias. The history of the great imperial centers, especially the Ganga Plains, tends to dominate the narrative. Many other regions remain understudied and historically marginalized.
Like where?
Large parts of the Northeast, for example, have distinct and ancient histories that are only beginning to be properly integrated. Areas of central India, forest regions, tribal belts, their long-term histories are often poorly understood or represented only from the perspective of encroaching state societies. We need focused efforts to research and write these diverse regional histories from the inside out.
And then there's the even harder challenge, writing the history of people who left no written records of their own, whose lives are usually only visible, if at all, through the biased lens of elite texts written about them, often by those who oppressed them.
That's perhaps the most profound challenge, recovering the voices and experiences of subordinated and marginalized groups. The vast majority of our source material, whether Sanskrit texts or royal inscriptions, reflects elite, usually upper caste male, ideas, interests, and perspectives.
So how do you write the history of the laboring poor, lower castes, tribal communities, even most women, when the sources seem designed to ignore or misrepresent them?
It requires different methodologies. Reading elite text against the grain, looking for inconsistencies, unintended admissions, silences, critically analyzing prescriptive texts versus actual practice, and relying much more heavily on archaeological data, settlement patterns, tools, burial practices, dietary evidence to try and infer the conditions of daily life, patterns of resistance, social interactions that texts don't record. It's painstaking work, but absolutely essential for a more complete history.
Another point raised is the need to break away from an overly insular view of Indian history. South Asia wasn't an island. Its past was deeply connected to the wider world.
Yes, the traditional focus has often been either purely internal or primarily looking westwards, towards Persia, Greece, Rome, Central Asia, mainly through the lens of invasions or trade via the northwestern passes.
But connections eastward were just as important.
Immensely important, and perhaps historically underappreciated in general narratives. We need much greater attention paid to South Asia's multifaceted relationships with East Asia, China, Tibet, and especially Southeast Asia.
Beyond just the spice trade.
Far beyond just trade networks, though those were vital, we need to explore the complex cultural transactions. The spread of Indian religions, particularly Buddhism, but also Hinduism, the adaptation of Indian scripts and languages, the influence of Indian political ideas, art styles, architectural forms, like temple building, across Southeast Asia. And the flow of ideas and people back into South Asia from these regions, too. It requires synthesizing evidence from texts, inscriptions, sculpture, architecture across this vast maritime space.
Okay, finally we come to the present day. History isn't just about the past, it's alive and sometimes weaponized in the present. Our source materials issue a strong warning about history becoming a contested terrain, deeply entangled in contemporary politics.
It's an unavoidable reality. Because history is so closely tied to individual and collective identity, who we think we are, where we came from the past inevitably becomes a battleground for present-day conflicts.
And the ancient past seems particularly prone to this.
Yes, perhaps because it's more remote, less documented in some ways, it's easier to project modern agendas onto it. We see the ancient past constantly invoked in contemporary political debates, often through outright propaganda with chauvinistic, nationalist, or religiously divisive aims. Think about disputes over archaeological sites, the rewriting of school textbooks to fit a particular narrative, claims about ancient inventions or golden ages.
This kind of charged atmosphere must pose a serious threat to careful, objective historical scholarship.
The dangers are very real and deeply concerning. When history becomes primarily a political tool, you inevitably get the deliberate manipulation and distortion of evidence to serve predetermined agendas. Historical arguments start being judged not on their academic merit, rigor, or basis in evidence, but on whether they support or undermine a particular political stance.
And historians themselves can come under attack.
Absolutely. Historians who try to present nuanced, complex, evidence-based accounts that challenge simplistic or politically convenient narratives can face criticism, censorship, intimidation, or worse. It creates a chilling effect on academic freedom and critical inquiry.
So the most urgent need today isn't just discovering new historical facts, but actually defending the space where those facts can be debated openly and rationally.
Precisely. It underscores the crucial need to actively define, protect, and enlarge a liberal academic space. This means fostering environments in universities, research institutions, public discourse that nurture level-headed dialogue, rigorous debate based on evidence, and genuine critical thinking, shielded as much as possible from direct political interference or intimidation. Preserving that space for inquiry is vital. #outro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly shown us just how complex it is to even begin studying ancient India. We've gone from defining the very ground underfoot to battling over how to slice up time to understanding the political baggage carried by the history books themselves. It can all feel a bit distant, maybe, academic, methodological squabbles. Why should you, the listener, care about these ancient debates and historiographical shifts?
The relevance is enormous, actually,
Yeah.
partly because, as we've touched on, the roots of so many present-day social practices, institutions, debates, and ideas, things like caste, gender roles, regional identities, religious tensions, often lie buried deep in that remote past. Understanding the origins helps us understand the present.
But perhaps the greatest value isn't just knowing the facts, but learning a way of thinking.
Absolutely. I think the most important lesson history teaches, especially a history as deep and complex as South Asia's, is how to think historically. That means realizing just how diverse and varied human experiences have been across time and space. It means becoming acutely aware of those tangled threads of continuity and change that connect our present moment all the way back. It teaches you how stories about the past are constructed, how they gain power, and how they can be critically examined.
And as we close today, we've talked a lot about the foundations, the geography, the fertile plains, the ancient stable Deccan Plateau, and those towering geologically active Himalayas in the north. Now, given that ongoing instability of those young mountains and the fundamental point that ecology itself has a history, here's something to consider as you go. How might future environmental shifts, maybe not human actions this time, but major geological events or significant climate change driven by larger forces, how might those reshape the physical canvas of South Asia yet again? And in doing so, perhaps dictate the next unwritten chapters of its long history.